On the buzz meter this Sunday, Donald Trump wins the media's praise for his surprise trip to Mexico, then endures the media's scorn for his fiery speech on illegal immigration. First, the meeting with Mexico's president.
Now here he is standing on the world stage with a world leader. This is a big step.
I think this is actually the single best day of the general election campaign for Donald Trump.
It seems that this probably turned out for Donald Trump to be a pivotal moment, and I would argue probably the best day of his campaign.
This is the best thing he's probably ever done in his life.
This was certainly the most diplomatic moment we've seen from Donald Trump.
Welcome to a quintessential Trumpian stunt. A hastily assembled trip to a country that has openly mocked him to meet with a leader that at one time compared him to Hitler.
A few hours later, the coverage turned sharply negative.
There will be no amnesty.
Trump yesterday, he's diplomat, and then he's red meat populist. And you're right, it's a contortionist.
Legal immigrants hear him say, "We don't want you." It's a terrible trap for Republicans, and Trump played into it.
It was, the Mexicans were bad again, and they're going to have to pay for the wall, and they're too dumb to know it yet. And by the way, the Mexican immigrants are committing crimes at just a historic pace and have to be kicked out.
Is the press being fair on immigration and on Trump's outreach yesterday at a black church? That FBI document dump on the Hillary Clinton email probe, does that change the media's handling of the case? The presidential debate moderators have been picked, and for the first time, one of them is from Fox News. A conversation with Chris Wallace. Plus, this story.
Hard to believe we're saying the sentence yet again, but former Congressman Anthony Weiner has been caught in yet another sexting scandal.
Clinton advisor Huma Abedin dumps Anthony Weiner after a New York Post expose. An embarrassment, sure, but should this be big political news? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Donald Trump stunned the media world by quickly accepting an invitation from Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto, and even some of his fiercest critics applauded the candidate's first foray onto the diplomatic stage.
There's a lot of value that can be created for both countries by working beautifully together.
But the coverage turned far more negative when Trump gave a loud, harsh, and fiery speech hours later in Arizona. And while softening one part of his plan, warned of the dangers of illegal immigration and blamed part of the problem on the press.
Only the out-of-touch media elites think the biggest problem facing American society, and you know this, this is what they talk about, facing American society today, is that there are 11 million illegal immigrants who don't have legal status.
Joining us now to analyze the campaign coverage, Heidi Presbella, senior political correspondent at USA Today. Sarah Flores, a Republican strategist and former aide to Carly Fiorina's campaign. And Ruth Marcus, deputy editorial page editor and columnist for The Washington Post. Heidi, let's just deal with the trip to Mexico. Is it fair to say that in this meeting with President Peña Nieto, that Trump and how he handled himself, that Trump got some rare media praise?
Yes, and I think the reason why is because it was the opposite outcome of what many of us were expecting. Like Chuck Todd said in the opening, here he was flying into the den of the man who had likened his rhetoric to Hitler and Mussolini, and instead, he walked out of there with a very presidential-looking accomplishment in his pocket. It was very respectful.
Chuck Todd said it was a stunt, but others were much more positive.
Well, most people were positive. Myself, I called it a win for him. And again, I think it was just like the expectations thing. That was not the outcome that we were expecting. But I also want to say, Howie, that I think this was a good example of how the media is really becoming the whipping boy for whatever news cycle doesn't benefit your candidate. Because I had gone on before the speech, and a lot of these people on the internet came back to kind of troll many of the journalists who had pronounced that a win without really respecting that you have to react within the 24-hour news cycle. And it was very much fair to
react to something that hasn't happened yet when the speech he hadn't given. Well, I was on the special report set right here in the studio with Charles Krauthammer and Steve Hayes, two of Trump's fiercest critics. And as you saw, they praised it, and I almost fell off my chair. So at least on the part of the Mexico visit, I mean, he did get a lot of praise.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never seen actually Twitter do the 180. I was watching the speech, you know, beforehand. Oh, there's no American flag. This is going to end his campaign. How could they possibly not have an American flag behind him? To, oh, huge win. And as an operative, I have to say there was something very refreshing about a campaign putting something together that quickly that wasn't perfect and yet was a win, because so often you're told, oh, can't be done. You need at least 3 months to possibly do a state visit. And it's like, no, you can do it in a day.
I like the way you proudly wear the word operative. Ruth Marcus, did the news accounts of the trip, though, undercut Trump a little bit when he said they hadn't discussed paying for the wall along the border, and Mexico's president said he had told Trump no way that would happen?
Well, I think Trump undercut himself a bit, and it wasn't the news accounts that undercut him. I did think, and you know, it's interesting that you actually can put on a play or put on a stunt or put on an event with a world leader with very little notice. I thought it was a smart move for him. I thought he carried it off well. I think we all tend a little bit with Trump to both overreact to the negatives and overreact to the positives. So the fact that he's there standing with the world leader, not spouting what we're used to from Trump, was a positive for him. It was a mistake for him to say something that it was easy for the Mexican president to then contradict. And then that actually compounded the problems he had later in the day with the speech, because he had to put, and they're going to pay for the wall, believe me, back into the speech. He said, I had to.
Is there medication for these wild mood swings about covering Trump? All right, so now let's go to the speech in Arizona, and it was pretty roundly criticized by the media, I mean, both in straight news reports and in the commentary. Is that because many in the press didn't like the tone, or was it more than that?
I'm going to go back again to the expectations argument, Howie, because many of the people who cover the Trump campaign know that the campaign itself had kind of set the expectation that he would be softening. Trump used that word, softening. Yes, yeah. And they didn't see the softening in the rhetoric, even though, to be fair, as a journalist, I have to point out, you know, there were some policy elements, like there was no mention of the Muslim ban. He really did leave it unclear whether there would be some immediate deportation of the 11 million, which has been the issue all along. And then there was also the expectation of, we are now seeing Trump 3.0. He's reaching out to minorities. He's reaching out to African Americans. He's apologizing for some things, and that this would fit into that narrative. This is the time he has to do it to reach these suburban independent women. But instead, the rhetoric was pretty much similar to what we had heard in the very beginning of the campaign. The emphasis on the criminality aspect of immigration, where this could have been an opportunity for him to kind of highlight the very good contributions that legal immigrants make to this country to try and balance it out a bit.
Well, I think Trump did say that it would be several years before most of the 11 million illegal immigrants would be deported until all these other steps took place. But he kind of buried it in the speech and kind of got buried in the coverage. But Ruth, is there a mindset among many journalists that modest immigration reform makes sense? This goes back to the debates in the Bush administration. And therefore, does that sentiment sort of creep into news stories when Trump is kind of depicted as a demagogue on this issue?
Well, I'm an opinion journalist, so modest immigration reform does make sense. It may creep into news stories, but I think that it was really the Trump campaign that set expectations, and that journalists were more reacting to the expectations of softening set by Trump and campaign, and actually accentuated by this statesman-like, might be a little bit strong, but totally credible performance in Mexico. So I was confused, just as not an operative, but I've seen some on TV, about what was the message that Trump was trying to send, because the day to me was kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Trump. And is he the statesman-like guy, or is he the round them all up guy? It was a little bit of softening, but he also made really clear there is no path to legalization without people leaving the country.
What also made news in the wake of the speech were the reactions of some previously supportive Hispanic folks, including a guy named Jacob Monte, who was on Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Here's what he said on MSNBC.
I had the naivety to believe that this guy was a businessman, that this guy was a Republican, and we didn't hear a Republican last night. We heard a populist propaganda con artist, and I'm done with it.
Does that sort of coverage hurt?
It does, and to both of your points about expectations, this is where you see why a larger campaign infrastructure, a more professional communications team actually does matter for coverage, because that's who's supposed to set those expectations. They're supposed to get you embargoed remarks ahead of time, like we were talking in the green room. They're supposed to have their surrogates prepped. Those guys, I think, were caught by surprise a lot on the Hispanic Advisory Board. You never want that to happen to your surrogate team.
But Sarah, don't you think one thing that might be going on here is that Trump's team is not necessarily unified in what message it wants to be sending?
I think some of them are surprised sometimes about what he's going out there and saying.
There has been stories about internal debate among the Trump advisors about how much to soften or not soften.
Which isn't a problem in and of itself. It's a problem, though, when you're talking about expectations for a big speech like that, where the reporters think they're heading into one thing, but they're actually going into another, and they're trying to tweet and write.
I kind of think, though, with some of the language in the speech, as a journalist, even if I had gotten that in advance, I would look at it and say, whoa, you know, zero tolerance, focusing only on immigrants as criminals, you know, these types of messages. Even if I'd seen it in advance, maybe I would have had some time to chew over the fact that he was easing up a bit on some of the policy. Right. However, I still think there would have been a lot of people surprised.
Well, you know, there are still Hispanics who support Trump, including this fellow, Marco Gutierrez, who went on MSNBC and said, my culture is a very dominant culture, and if we don't do something about it, you're going to have taco trucks on every corner. I don't know how helpful that was.
With Hispanics like this, who needs enemies? Really?
But my point about the media mindset, there's a Morning Consult poll out today, actually. It says by 56 to 37%, people say they believe that all immigrants should go back to their home countries and have to reapply for admission, which is a position that many in the press view as extreme.
Yes, but you know, it sounds fair, but then when you start, now this is the opinion journalist to me, then when you start kind of going through the logistics of it, of course, Trump has always said, and the good ones are going to come back in, and you know, it's just not, it's not practically
and you
feasible.
Can use different numbers too. I mean, you can use
people believe contradictory things.
How you ask the question.
Before we go, I want to talk to you about two political headlines, and this is the polls that we're all obsessed with. So one headline is Clinton's advisors tell her to prep for a landslide. The other one is inside Trump Tower, facing grim reality, and Trump's campaign is described as teetering and threatening to collapse. A bit too far based on late August, early September polls?
You can't call a race, especially at this point and before we've even had a debate. That said, in defense of some of this coverage, we did see a pretty big gap in the past couple of weeks in some of these battleground states, which, you know, as scholars of elections, we know these are the battleground states that, that determine the election. But that said, these polls are swinging very erratically. That doesn't make them incorrect, but you certainly can't call a race.
It's a great spectator sport. Let me get a break. Remember to write to us, and I'll respond. It's MediaBuzz@foxnews.com or at Howard Kurtz on Twitter. When we come back, that FBI release of its interview with Hillary Clinton and a memo summarizing the investigation. Does it change the media's handling of this case? And later, is the latest Anthony Weiner embarrassment anything other than a tabloid tale?